Good morning. We're looking forward to this discussion. My name is Chinyu Zhang. I'm a policy advisor here at the Western Governors Association. Today, we'll have the privilege to have a conversation about unlocking capital for housing development. Particularly in the West, we have experienced underdevelopment and underinvestment. This panel discussion will examine innovative and creative solutions to getting capital onto the ground to develop that missing middle for the middle-income household owners. Today, we have a host of experts here to discuss this. I'm going to turn the time over to our moderator, Dejan Eskic. He's a senior research fellow at the Gardner Policy Institute. Dejan, I'm turning the time over to you.
Good morning. Talking about housing finance, it's so hard for me to talk about housing just from one perspective. And as we're doing our opening remarks, I was thinking about what to say. And the most innovative thing in housing finance we have is the 30-year mortgage, as kind of evolved out of the New Deal, and that was about it. And we've had several periods of strong housing production. One was in the 70s going into 80s. Savings and loans really spurred that part of it, and then it was the great financial crisis where we were giving mortgages to dogs, and I think we have some opportunities to do some better things here. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say. And we'll go down the line for introductions and opening remarks.
Thanks, Dejan. Steve Waldrip, I'm the Governor Cox's housing policy advisor. I think my official title is Senior Advisor for Housing Strategy and Innovation. All right, Alexa says I got it right. They did that before I took this job, or I would have picked a different title for myself. I've been doing this for a year. Before that, I was in the legislature for 4 years. As Cam noted, I worked on housing policy in the legislature, and prior to that, co-founded a social benefit fund focused on providing ownership opportunities to teachers, firefighters, the people that used to be able to get a home in our society and no longer can afford to own a home. And so that background really aligned me with the governor when he laid out his vision for 35,000 starter homes. I actually saw that for the first time when I was introduced as the person taking this job. I didn't know that. They didn't tell me that when they were saying, hey, do you want to take this job? They neglected that part. And so I'm sitting there looking at this poster in front of me going, oh, 35,000, 5 years. And I did some math, not in my head, I actually had my calculator, but it's 0.8 per hour over 5 years, every hour for 5 years. And so at the beginning, I was calculating how many houses I had to have started, over the first, month or whatever. And then I gave up on that because that was way too painful. But the goal is appropriate. And the goal is appropriate because the focus that we really have to keep, in my opinion, is on getting people into the game. Right now in Dejan, I get all my info from Dejan, but somewhere between 93% around that neighborhood of current non-homeowners in Utah cannot afford the median priced home. Is that about right?
On the money.
Yeah. So we have a 7% home ownership median capacity right now. If you drop that down to a $375,000 home, we might increase to 25% of our non-homeowners can afford that. That's a disaster. That is a looming long-term disaster for our society, for our economy, for our social structure. We're a 70% ownership society, and that's created the wealth that we're now enjoying, starting with post-World War II. So that's why that focus is so critical. That's why the governor chose it as his focal point, and that's what I stay awake thinking about at night.
Howard?
Yeah, I'm Howard Headlee. I'm the president of the Utah Bankers Association. I've served in that capacity for 28 years and seen a lot of issues related to housing in that period. It's an issue I'm passionate about. for some of the reasons that Steve discussed. Housing is so much more than just shelter, right? It drives fundamental economics. I speak to groups a lot, and I talk about the pursuit of happiness and what makes America distinct from really any country ever created in the history of the world. And we established that the pursuit of happiness was an unalienable right, is fundamental, is life and liberty. It's a pretty stunning declaration and a pretty huge stretch goal. And it's really what I think has driven this country to be different. And housing and a home, we talk about the American dream. It's central to that pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness in America today doesn't happen without banks. Whatever your pursuit is, it usually connects to a bank, whether it's savings or credit or access to your savings or credit. So I'm passionate about what I do and who I represent. Utah is the 5th largest banking state in the country. And most visitors to Utah don't understand that, our role in that banking ecosystem. We just surpassed $1 trillion in assets headquartered in Utah banks. And so I love what I do, and I love the topics that I get to deal with, and one of those is housing, and it's a serious challenge. And I'm sorry that Steve is up at night worried about it's
No, you're not.
It's worthy of that
He's
because
not worried about me.
we have supply. There's issues on the supply side and the demand side, and I've had the privilege of working with Steve on both sides of this equation. It's something that we just simply have to unlock capital. I think the title of this presentation is perfect for what we're talking about. Capital is the issue on both sides of that equation, access to it. We went through the crisis of 2008, let's say 15 years ago. The reaction to that, I will just say to you, I think was nonsense. It was absolute nonsense, the way the government, it was all about finger pointing and blame. And just now I feel like we're starting to talk about actual real solutions to what was wrong, because they're showing up in other ways. We didn't solve the fundamental problems with the mortgage markets. And so now they're showing up in different ways. And I think we're starting to realize, we didn't fix it with Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank was not a fix. It was an excuse. And I hope we're at a point where we can start talking about actually fixing the issues. But these 30-year mortgages that we're talking about, the structure, the 100% debt, home ownership, is creating other problems. It ties us to challenges that folks like Steve are trying to solve that make it very inflexible to try to solve the pricing, affordability. We don't want the prices to come down. That's very disruptive. And so now I think we just have to understand, unless incomes go up dramatically, we're going to have to deal with affordability in a different way. And then we try to get builders to build product that's affordable when they want to build something that's more profitable. You can't, we've got significant problems on both the supply side and the demand side. And I hope we get a chance to talk about all of that in this panel today, because if we don't solve those issues, problem's not going to go away, and millions of Americans are going to be denied, the American dream, the pursuit of happiness, things that people have fought and died for. We're trying to now figure a way to deliver, and I think that's a worthy discussion. So I'm glad you're here to talk about it. I'm honored to be asked to participate.
Thank you. Or Ahmad.
Thank you. Ahmad Abu-Khalaf, Research Director with Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national nonprofit organization focused on advancing affordable housing solutions. So we do policy and programmatic work, finance housing, and also operate and build housing in the Mid-Atlantic region. Looking at this from the bigger picture, we can't talk about building other types of housing without thinking about single-family zoning, which has been dictating a lot of what is built and what has been built, especially when it comes to home ownership. And that's why we have seen a lot of states, including states on the West Coast or in the West region like Montana, Arizona, Colorado, and Washington, adopting some zoning reforms that would allow for some forms of multifamily housing in areas that were previously just reserved for one type, the traditional detached single-family home. The issue is that because of the gap between wages and housing prices, a lot of people are priced out of areas because they cannot afford the prices of the traditional single-family homes. So the idea is that and I know the industry is very guilty of using multiple terms to define the same thing. So low density multifamily housing, also known as gentle density, missing middle, it's a type of multifamily housing somewhere in between, with a density somewhere in between the traditional single family home and large scale and dense multifamily housing. So that is really based on the local density context. But think about introducing newer types or different types of housing, like an accessory dwelling unit, a duplex, triplex, fourplex with up to 4 units, or sometimes even up to 10 units in an area where you only have single family homes. So that is a concept that is based on first unlocking land. You have smaller types of multifamily housing in an area where they previously did not exist, so just based on square footage and the amount of land used per unit could be a little bit more attainable. So I'm not talking about subsidized housing, just unsubsidized, attainable market rate housing. And then also, you can't talk about unlocking land. Then you provide an opportunity to get it built, but then you need to unlock the capital needed to get it built. And there are a lot of factors that impact that, including, is it a single site? So are we building just one triplex, or the developer is having a subdivide site with like 20 townhouses? Who is building that? Is it the homeowner adding the accessory dwelling units or converting their single family home into a duplex? Or do we have an emerging small scale developer who will be dealing with a lot of challenges with accessing capital? And I'm excited to discuss some of these challenges, but also some solutions to these challenges today.
Great. So just for some context to it, Ahmad, as you were talking, looking at projections, our housing shortage across the country, depending on how you look at it, is between 3 to 5 million units short. When we look at what's built, in 1960s, the average home size for a house built in the 1960s was about 1,500. Household size was 3.3 peoples per household. Okay, today our average house unit size is about 2,200 square feet. So we've gone up about 700 square feet on the footprint of the building. Yet our household size has dropped down to 2.5. So we've lost almost a whole person per household, okay? But we've increased our housing size. So, it's hard to have this conversation without the context of like what we're building. So our strong demographics aren't enough to push housing supply. So talking about these challenges in finance, what are some of these challenges, and this goes to any three of you, that are currently facing the industry? Howard, you're the banker, so it sounds like you.
No, go ahead. Jim.
Okay, I could start, and then you can jump in for sure and talk about the technical side. I think from the policy perspective, again, there are some universal issues right now, right? The cost of capital, insurance issues, the cost of construction, cost of land. And this is universal regardless of what you're trying to build. Just thinking about the micro issue for a little bit. As I mentioned before, you're trying to build something where demand for this type of housing has not been proven in a lot of markets because it's a newer idea. So I think there's that perceived risk among lenders. You need to convince them that once these duplexes are built or triplexes are built, there will be enough demand and they won't be sitting vacant on the market for long periods. Also, again, it depends on who's tackling that. Is it the existing homeowner, single-family homeowner, trying to build an accessory dwelling unit that could be more attainable for a younger family who wants to live in the area and they're priced out otherwise? Or is it an emerging small-scale developer getting into the industry and trying to build a fourplex on a single site, and then there's also the perceived risk because they may not meet some of the lending requirements, like having the track record, the successful track record, or liquidity or other requirements. And it's different for the experience of a subdivision being turned into townhouses or duplexes. Overall, I think perceived risk is an issue. Also, showing that there's sufficient demand in some markets is an issue. But again, there are some broader universal issues with the cost of construction, cost of labor, insurance issues, and we need to talk about how do you contain the cost. Is that a loan guarantee by the state and local financing entity? Is it offering publicly owned land or faith-based owned land at a discounted price to make that development financially feasible and pencil out? Or is it an insurance support that is needed to make that work happen? And this is in very broad terms, so I'll let you get to the wonky part, Howard.
Well, I have tremendous respect for the work that Enterprise does around the country. And you're working within a paradigm that I think is broken. And we have to step back and acknowledge that, this notion of 30-year mortgages, 100% debt financed, putting people in this, right on the edge of a financial cliff. They qualify with two incomes, and then if anything happens, a job, a health issue, right? First, let me just say, it's a daunting issue. The numbers that you lay out there are overwhelming, and they keep people like Steve up at night.
I can't change it, I'm sorry.
And I would just say, I think the answer to these issues are a lot of little things that have to change. So it's a lot of, you can't just focus on one side of this equation or everybody wants like one solution. But one of those little things, it's not so little, has to do with how we finance homes. And you look at what's driving a lot of the distortions, the affordability, is the investors really want this asset class. They want the single family detached housing in their portfolios. And so I think close to 25% of purchases last year were investor purchases, to rent, which is important from a standpoint of shelter, but not really central to this American dream notion of the bigger picture of wealth creation and so forth. So something that Steve and I have worked on for a few years now is the idea of getting investors and homeowners on the same side of the table rather than competing with each other and driving this pricing up. In creating a model whereby homeownership isn't always just all or nothing, 100%. You can make homeownership affordable and own 60% of your home or 74% of your home, and fill the other gap with investors that want that asset class. But that requires a lot of changes in laws, tax laws, Fannie, Freddie rules. There's a lot of things that have to change, but I see, personally, coming out of the financial crisis, I see that as a big part of the solution, because if you live within that paradigm of all you're doing in terms of affordability is based upon this 100% debt ownership model, well, then we have to build stock that fits into that affordability gap, and so we have to build interesting new things for which demand hasn't been, yet proven, and do things that neighbors don't like and cities don't want to zone for, right? So it's all built upon this notion of the way we finance the home purchase. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I think the time has come to really address that, but that's going to require, serious federal involvement, changes to rules and tax laws and so forth. So it's a big deal, but it's something that we're doing here in Utah on a trial basis, on a pilot basis. We've attracted, I don't know how much capital, 100 million in capital from investors that are interested in this notion. For an investor standpoint, it's a much more attractive than buying stock and renting it, but partnering with homeowners and having an owner-occupied property that they own 40% of or 50% of. The person's going to take care of the property, and if they're going to deploy the same amount of capital, then they're deploying it over more units, so it actually diversifies their risk. So it's a much better model. There's a lot more affordability options within that model. And that's something that Steve and I have been working on, and we're starting to see other models come into play. So that's just one piece of it. I could go on in terms of financing the construction is another issue that we're wrestling with in Utah, and because in the end, who builds this stock? Who finances the construction of that stock? It's primarily smaller community banks. That there's financing the construction of it, and I can tell you, you don't want to spend time today, talking about all the challenges that these smaller community banks face, but there are some serious challenges that they're facing, and so their ability to step in and finance the construction of the millions of units that you're talking about is seriously limited, and that can be a real frustration.
Yeah, and let me just add on to what Howard said. I think it's really important, and many of you here will know this, but just to understand what Howard is saying when he says our system is broken. For most of the history of our kind of modern financial structure, the median home price in the United States was 3 times the median wage. And I think in 1984, 95% of the country was at or below that ratio. The outliers were like New York City and San Francisco and LA. And so it was 3 to 1, 3 to 1, 3 to 1. Our whole financial system was built on that ratio. And in Utah today, we're about 6 to 1. So, and that's happened over the last 7 years. And so when you think about what's happening to individuals, we've gone from this structure where everybody kind of had this expectation. We've exploded that now. And so you've got to have double the income to buy the same asset. And our structures aren't set up. We had the 80-20, 20% down, 80% loan. It all worked based on that 3 to 1 ratio. That 3 to 1 ratio is gone. It is gone for a long time. Anybody who thinks that housing prices, construction costs are coming down anytime soon, labor costs are going to decrease, I mean, that's just not going to happen. We now have, immigration maybe threats, and that's going to impact labor. Tariffs are going to impact the cost of supplies and materials. And our population is growing. We've got this massive pent-up demand. And so all of those factors are just going to continue to push house prices up. And so that's the brokenness of the system that we're confronting. And that's why what we've been doing for the last 100 years since the New Deal really has to be re-looked at. That's the, the unlocking capital piece has to take into account a new structure to recognize the reality of where we are today and what we're looking at for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think, government has not typically been involved in market rate housing. It's only been low income housing because that's where we were needed. And now we're going to be involved in market rate housing for a long time to come.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah,
And Steve,
I'm ready to go for like
let
the
me
next
just-
40 years, sure.
So,
Let me just jump
you know-
on this, just when he talks about housing prices, and I referred to it earlier, you don't want them to come down, right? Probably anybody in this room that owns a property, look what happened in 2008, 9, 10. It's very painful when it comes down. I mean, there are pressures pushing it up, but we're not situated well to have real estate prices dropping, and it affects local governments and property tax revenues and so forth. So we're not wishing for that, but we are saying we got to approach this differently. I'm going to share one last thing, because I don't want to stay on one side of the equation. Talking about supply. I'm talking about mostly financing the demand, but the supply side of this thing, and these small banks that are financing the construction of all this housing in Utah. What we discovered when we came up with when the governor made this announcement, I started getting phone calls from local banks saying, how are we going to do that? 35,000 homes in 5 years. These are the guys that mostly finance these small builders that are building, all these homes. And they're good banks. Utah has the most profitable banks in the country. And that means they've got their deposit base and they're lending out those deposits. That's what we do. We lend out the deposits. And when you're lending out, let's say 60% of those deposits, and 40% are sitting in U.S. government securities or something like that, that's not a good equation. You end up sometimes, when interest rates go up, you end up paying more on your deposits than you're getting from your loans. So a bank needs to be lent out like 90% plus loan to deposits, right? Yeah. Well, when the governor announces 35,000 units in 5 years, and most of the banks that finance that construction are already in the 90 percentile lent to deposits, who's going to finance the construction of those units? And I immediately got the calls, and I called Steve and said, we love to help. This is what we do, and we're on Team Utah. And so we started looking for deposits. We need more deposits in the banks to make the loans. And what we discovered was, and I'm glad Cam is back in the room. So I'm being transparent with my concerns, because it requires teamwork to solve these issues. But we've got local cities, towns, counties, special districts, the state of Utah that are collecting revenues, and they hold reserves. Every state, every local government has more money than they need at the moment, right? It's just prudent, right? They have reserves, sometimes required. And they of course, they look at those monies and they say, what are we going to do with these monies while we're not using them? Well, we want to make as much interest off those reserves as possible. We can make more money for our city or for our town or our county. It makes total sense. They have a fiduciary duty. And in Utah, they transfer that money to the state treasurers, the Public Treasurers Investment Fund, PTIF, is that?
Yep.
PTIF.
PTIF.
And the state treasurer, Marlo Oaks, who does this professionally, does an amazing job of taking all that money and goes out in the commercial markets and enhances the yield on those reserves for those cities and towns. They're making more money on those reserves by buying commercial paper in Toronto or New York or Japan or wherever, London. And it's great for they make more money on those reserves. It used to be 10, 15 years ago, those monies were deposited in local banks. And local banks then used those deposits to make loans in the local community to build housing and things like that. So in an effort to chase yield and to be more efficient that way as cities and towns, we now have $30 billion of capital, Utah capital, that is being invested outside the state of Utah, not being deposited in local banks, not financing construction of homes. And that's a real problem. Utah is doing very well. We're not doing that well.
We're building Walmarts in China. I mean, that's the reality.
We can't take that amount of money out of our economy and export it elsewhere. And so we've got to come to grips with some of these issues if we're going to build, 35,000 units in 5 years.
Yeah. Well, Steve and Ahmad, do you have anything to add? I just want to make sure.
No, that was great. I think, thinking about the two sides, the consumer, the home buyer, and then the developer who will build these homes. And I agree. I think if it's a small scale developer doing a small loan balance, that's not always easy to underwrite because you have a lot of fixed costs and loan underwriting. You need the legal fees, all of these pre-development fees, the studies, all of that. And for some underwriters, you have fixed costs, and then the loan amount is smaller, so they're getting less, costs or less. They're paid less in underwriting fees. So sometimes it's not even worth it for them. So thinking about who is lending, these fixed costs, and some of these challenges with getting the small balanced loans. And going back to the role of government, I think traditionally, Freddie, Fannie, and also FHA, they have been doing a lot of acquisition or refinance loans, not new construction. And I think in FHA, it's an owner-occupied, so you could technically buy a triplex or a fourplex, but you would have to live in one of the units and then rent the remaining 2 or 3. So also thinking about the existing models. But I think, from wearing the policy hat, thinking about the new administration, is there a role for the Opportunity Zones Part 2 program, which is likely coming back? Do you reform it to see a larger impact on housing that we did not see in the former Trump administration? And what does that mean for unlocking new capital for housing construction? Because the gap is huge. I think it's up to 6 million homes, or between 2 and 6 million homes nationwide. So I think most big cities, or probably every city or town, has a supply gap that needs to be filled over the next couple of years or decade, if I'm being very optimistic.
So I bring the problems to Steve, and then he solves them. So I think sometimes I talk more to Steve than I do to my wife.
We're like this.
I much rather prefer to get yelled at by. Well, Steve's never yelled
How
at.
do I
never yell
join
at
this
him.
club? Just asking Steve to fix the issues.
I'm kinder to him than his wife is sometimes.
That's 100% true. But let's bring some solutions to this doomy and gloomy conversation. You've been busy. The legislator, the governor's been busy. We have a first-time homebuyer program. We've talked about this first Utah investment program, using some of this money. Talk to us kind of how that's starting and what the potential of that is.
Yeah, we're working on supply side. There's a lot of discussion. We need to get homeowners. We need to get lower interest rates so people can afford to buy homes. The problem is we don't have homes for them to buy. That is fundamentally the issue. And if we don't start there and we juice the demand side of the equation, we go back to 2021 when prices are skyrocketing. If interest rates went back down to 2%, it would be the worst thing to happen to housing since 2021, because that created this false sense of affordability and drove pricing up. And now that interest rates are back to normal, everybody's going, well, the housing is too expensive now. And it's because we had that artificially low interest rate. So until we get that supply-demand in balance, we're not going to see any moderation of increases in home, and we're not going to see opportunities that we're used to seeing in housing. And so all of our policy pushes go to that supply side right now, not all of them. The majority of our policy pushes go to that supply side, and they should and they have to. And so, as Dejan mentioned, we created the Utah Home Investment Program, which takes advantage of some of the money we have in our state reserves. We put a small amount, $300 million, so like 1% of our state's reserves, in a sidecar fund to make available for construction lending at a lower interest rate, 2 points, 3 points lower for construction loans. Now, the reality is that's about a $2,000 or $3,000 savings per unit, maybe $4,000. That's not that much. That's not going to change the equation. What changes the equation is that these funds require the developer in the city or the builder in the city to work together to create smaller lots and put smaller homes on smaller lots. We have to go back to that fundamental principle of smaller things on smaller pieces of property. And it's a challenge with a lot of municipalities because no one wants it in their backyard. I joke that we need to have a resolution in our state legislature, and I'd welcome Arizona and other states to follow, that if you are not native born with no children, you cannot speak out against housing at a public meeting because you are the problem. The only people that can say anything are those who have been here their whole life and have no children, have not contributed one bit to the problem. Everybody else is in moral hazard territory, right? But we're up against that. And so we've been working on getting tools to our local elected officials, prioritizing, the golden society of, teachers, first responders, veterans, active duty military families, trying to put those individuals in the front of those ownership opportunities. And so that gives local officials who are taking heat from their constituents the opportunity to say, hey, these are the people we want in our community. And we're still talking about $350,000 homes. I mean, we're not talking about homeless people coming into a $350,000 home. These are as inexpensively as you can get them right now. So that's one way we're doing it. We're also working, we're making a really concerted effort right now on condos. If we can solve that issue and bring entry-level condos back into the market in force, that's a game changer because it provides the home ownership that our community partners want. They want more homeowners than renters. All we've been building in multifamily lately is rentals because a number of reasons. If we can bring condos back into that equation, entry-level condos, then that creates another layer of affordability kind of down a step, half step down. And so we're looking at, see how I describe this, a state-funded and focused effort to provide revolving capital for condo development. Utah has solved statutorily some of the liability issues that go with condos that our neighbors, when, we're the healthy patient in a room full of people with cancer. Arizona's got cancer, California, Colorado, everybody else has cancer because their liability around condos is still extreme. And Utah has cut that liability back to sort of normal ranges. And so we don't have the risk of the class action lawsuits that a lot of other states have. And we've had that for like 10 years now. And the markets are saying, we couldn't care less that Utah solved that. You're not big enough. You're in this risk pool with all of these other people, and they all still have those other liability issues. So we're saying, hey, we've got to solve this ourselves. We've got to create our own state level solutions to these things. And so that will be a focus of what we're doing. We want to pair that with public lands. We have a lot of public land in Utah, and I'm not talking about Forest Service and BLM and SITLA and those big pieces. I'm talking about UDOT gave us a list of 300 acres, 380 acres that they just had laying around. They're like, this is our transportation department. They're like, oh yeah, we got some surplus land. And like in 3 days, they came up with this list of 380 acres in transportation corridors and infrastructure, and all of it's right there. And so if we can take advantage of those parcels, create condo ownership opportunities in there, maybe use that land as a catalyst to drive down pricing. That's the kind of thing that we're working on, and doing it again in partnership with our municipalities who want this type of opportunity for their residents. I think that's what we need to do. That's what we're working on, and all of our solutions are sort of geared toward that entry-level ownership opportunity, because everything else will follow that.
Can I just, Steve, the condo thing is, I mean, guessing anybody from another state is aware of,
How sick they are.
we have to, yeah, I guess I just say, extend any assistance or help or ideas. When I see what's driving the liability issues that make it condos development impossible, you can see really clearly that you're hurting people more than you're helping them, and we just have to have that conversation that we're hurting folks more than we're helping them on the class action liability side, and so for the state, the fact of the matter is what banks do, we manage risk, and so we identify risk, we analyze it, we manage it. And when I look at those issues, the risks are manageable. It's the legal exposure that we've got to get real with, and to have the state of Utah step in and actually deal with the issues that the insurance underwriters don't want to deal with. That's a pretty extreme approach to it. It would be better off kind of locking arms and figuring out ways to manage those risks, as neighbors and friends, and then forcing the insurance underwriters to get those, because we talk about starter homes, but our populations are getting older, and you see this transition where people then come back and they leave a house, a detached single-family residence with 2 levels, and they don't want the stairs, and they want to move into something where there's an elevator or just a single level, and that creates, so like I say, there's a lot of little things that can solve this problem, but we've got to get the condo thing fixed.
Can I add just one quick thing? I completely support all of the strategies that Steve mentioned. They're intended to lower the cost of development, and that could translate to lower housing prices. I think one thing that we should also talk about is the cost of regulations. How long does it take to get the housing permitted, approved, all of that? Also, some of the excessive requirements. Are you asking that fourplex with 4 units for like 10 or plus parking spaces, and then that translates to both, or potentially it could translate into physical infeasibility because they cannot fit those number of parking spots on this lot, but also the cost of that. Does that translate into underground parking that is more expensive to create? So I think all of that, the cost of sometimes like the things that are not very tangible, but they are for developers, and then they translate into higher costs is really important.
Yeah, and Cam and Justin, I did not tell them to talk about parking. We're in the middle of parking discussions with the league, and makes Cam break out into a cold sweat. Because some of the parking regulations are excessive. We have examples here in Utah where we have, I was at a community somewhere south of here, 1,400 square foot townhome, 4 stalls on site, 2 in the garage, 2 in front of the garage, and 1 visitor stall off of in the project, 1 per unit. I mean, that's like Walmart at Christmas time. I mean, it's extreme. And so those are the things that we really, that's where we have to address the parking issues.
So we have just a few minutes left in our closing remarks. What do we want to leave the crowd with?
Happiness.
Any questions?
Yeah, we'll open it up to questions here in a second, but just want to give you guys the final word. If we don't need to, we can go straight to questions.
Yeah, I like to be optimistic at the end. We talk about all the issues at the beginning and then leave with solutions. I think what I would leave everyone with is reimagining the housing ecosystem seems like the framework that we need. People would need to make some adjustments. Either it's like downsizing, creating new smaller homes on smaller lots, and thinking about, how do we buy and rent houses and all of that, and also financing side and the demand side. So I think a lot of smaller changes that would ultimately have a significant impact on the way we finance, build housing, and also afford housing is what is needed. And this concept of unlocking land and changing zoning and rethinking how capital is provided is happening in a lot of jurisdictions because there's an acute housing supply and affordability challenge everywhere. So I think a lot of folks are focused on solutions, which is great. We just need to scale these solutions to get to a point where we're building enough and we're financing enough housing to have an impact on the acute housing affordability and supply challenges.
Steve, Howard, anything to close with?
My overriding comment, I'll let Steve deal on the supply side, because that's what you live and breathe. But on the demand side, or just the way we finance housing, we've got to align investor capital with homeowners. And so to the extent there's anybody here that has influence in Washington, D.C., or we've just got to start with that mantra. Right now, there's a little bit of a investors are bad and homeowners are good, and I think that there's no way you're going to solve that. Capital is king.
Yeah, we can't bully.
And so we need to figure out ways to change our laws, our rules, our structures to get their interests aligned. And that's then we'll have a lot more options on the stock side. You can build different things and we can make them affordable on the other side of the equation.
Last word, Steve.
I would just say, I walk around with a bag of guilt and I try to leave it in every room that I enter. And the reality is this, housing is no longer a policy issue. It's no longer a political issue. It's become a moral issue. When we look at our values as Utahns, as Americans, our values align with what Howard talked about, is this ability for people to pursue happiness, this social contract that we have with our kids and our grandkids. If you do these things, then you get the American dream. And we have a generation coming up right now that is going, I've done all these things, and I'm looking at the future, and I don't see the dream. And that's a moral hazard for our country. I think we're seeing it reflected in a tragic thing that just happened with a healthcare CEO. And the reaction to that, if you've noticed the reaction to that tragedy online, it's been totally disturbing, right? Young people are saying, stick it to the man. Why are they saying that? They're saying that because they're looking at our system and saying, this system is no longer working for me. What have I got to lose? We need to blow the system up. When you go back in history a little bit, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Why did they march? Because they said, what have I got to lose? The system no longer functions for me. And so that's the lens we have to look at this issue in, is what do we care about the most? And I think what we care about the most when you boil it all down is, what are we leaving for our kids and our grandkids? What are future generations going to inherit from us? And we talk about that in terms of climate and a lot of other things. Housing is now at that level where we have to approach it from a standpoint of moral obligation to provide this opportunity. And that changes conversations around capital returns and asking developers and lenders and everybody to say, take a step into the middle. You don't have to be the only one, but you have to join in taking the step with our cities, with others. We have to all step into the middle one step and not hold out on the edges where you hold out for your best deal. You step into the middle and you work on a good deal. We have to have developers, they got to make money or they can't pay their people, who then can't afford the houses. But they don't have to maximize. They don't have to push it to the edges. And so that's the morality of this issue that I try to leave when I go and talk to people, is that this is a real problem today, and it will be a debilitating problem in the future if we don't solve it today.
Well, that's sobering. Questions?
I try to be happy.
Laura.
Hi there, thanks. You all talked a little bit about de-risking condominiums, but there was an interesting article in the New York Times this morning about homeowners insurance policies being dropped across the nation due to increased, flooding, wildfire, a variety of things. And in Utah, one in every 100 policies is currently being dropped in Utah. If you can't get a mortgage, because you have no homeowners insurance, that's a whole different challenge. Are there any conversations happening nationally or locally about this topic?
I used to like you.
Sorry, Steve.
I don't know. I mean, Ahmad, are you hearing
There
about
are
that?
national conversations. If you have found a solution, you're the lucky winner. At this point, I think, there are valid concerns about rebuilding again and again in climate risk vulnerable area, but I think also a lot of households, they're just getting their insurance dropped, and it's not like we're talking about second homes, vacation homes. This is their only home, they invested everything in it, so what do you do then? So I can see both sides, but definitely like all the policymakers, the researchers are trying to find out a new solution for this issue. Again, I have not heard about any promising solutions. I think some states are even trying to jump in at this point and having state-backed, home insurance option just to prevent a big crisis from happening when a lot of homeowners are dropped at once. But TBD, what's going to come out of all these conversations about finding solutions.
The similarity is just the risk pool issue, right? And when you have a risk pool and somebody does something in the pool that nobody likes, it's a problem. I think that Utah deals with a lot of contagion from other areas, but the condo issue is no different. So I'm not an insurance expert, but it's another one of our huge problems that shows that things are kind of broken, and there's no easy solutions until you solve for those issues. So it's a good point.
Other questions? One of you.
I have. This is actually directed at you.
Okay.
I'm curious. Oh, I don't really need this. But thank you. I'm curious on the land trust, if that kind of fits your prescription for investors. The investment side of that equity piece that you were discussing. And then also, on a side adventure, I was wondering if you would hit on the income as well. That was at the very beginning that you were mentioning how incomes are not keeping up with housing prices. I know that's two totally different tangents.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Well, on the land trust issue, I don't have a definitive answer for you, because I see different land trusts structured very differently, and some work better than others. We're looking at one right now, a model with some manufactured housing, just to try to see if that solves for the cost of the land issue, right? So what we're trying to do is bifurcate that, and but how it's structured is very important to the investors, and I don't think I have any insights for you this morning.
Questions?
And with regard to the income issue, I guess what I'm saying is, well, we know what the problems are. There's a way for incomes to catch up to housing, and it's called inflation, right? And but I think the ship has sailed, so to speak, that the ratios that Steve outlines, bringing those back by bringing the pricing down is very painful. It's economically disastrous. So the only other way to change the ratios is to bring the incomes up, and there's ways to do that. I'll be optimistic. I think the relationship between AI and productivity is a huge potential, saving, economically saving. It has the potential to save that situation. I mean, productivity allows us to grow GDP without threatening inflation, and so I see enormous gains in productivity through AI. Then you'll have other issues related to that, like you see on our dock workers and so forth. But those are huge problems. I don't have the answers. I just know that it's a problem, and there's problems in how to solve for that. But we have to raise incomes. But I don't see housing prices coming down to solve the ratio.
Yeah. And Michelle, I'd say I'm optimistic. I wouldn't be sitting up here and doing this job if I didn't think we could solve this. I'm super optimistic about our ability as Utahns, because we have this sort of tight-knit society. We're a solution-based culture. I think we can have meaningful input into this and create solutions. And I think as a country, we've been through a lot of tough times. We get through it. We figure it out. We're really good at innovation, but it takes pressure. It takes work, and it takes a lot of people kind of leaning into these problems. And I think we do that. I really am optimistic that we can make meaningful progress and create solutions.
The answers are always in the title of this presentation: unlocking capital.
Yeah.
We just have to unlock capital. Will solve these issues, and a little bit of regulatory change here, and reinventing kind of how capital interacts with the supply and the demand side. I think this solves actually quickly. We just have to be thinking beyond the traditional 30-year mortgage and those structures. The insurance side is, I see we drove her out of the room.
Yeah.
That's the same issue, unlocking capital.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. Thank you to the panelists and for listening to us. And with that, we'll take a little break and reconvene at 10:30. Thank you.